He built something from nothing. Over the better part of a decade, he turned more than 500 acres of raw, undeveloped land in northern New Hampshire into a functioning homestead, constructing buildings, raising animals, growing food, digging ponds, and filming every step of it. The channel grew to 350,000 subscribers. One single video crossed 13 million views. By every reasonable measure, the mission had been accomplished. Then Lumna changed the mission entirely, not by walking away, not by quitting, but by purchasing a completely different property, a 150-year-old vacant farm, and announcing that Lumna Acres was starting over in a new direction. Homesteading was out, regenerative farming was in, and the channel that had documented more than a decade of building one life was now beginning the documentation of a different one. So why does a person do that? Why does someone who spent years proving a thing can be done, who built a loyal audience watching them prove it, and who finally arrived at the destination they set out for, why does that person buy an old abandoned farm and start from scratch again? The answer is not simple. It involves a shift in philosophy that had been developing quietly for years, a visit from one of the most respected regenerative farmers in the United States, and a decision that Al himself has described as the most ambitious thing his family has ever attempted. But to understand the decision, you first have to understand the man who made it, and where he started before any of this existed. Alcide Lumna grew up in Massachusetts. Public records place him in the North Attleboro area before the family relocated to New Hampshire, and the Boston accent his early viewers picked up on immediately was real. A Boston area kid who ended up building a homestead in the White Mountains. He did not come from farming. There was no family land, no agricultural background, no inherited knowledge of how to raise animals or work raw acreage. Before Lumna Acres became a full-time operation, Al worked as a subcontractor. He mentioned this directly in an early interview, describing the schedule it gave him and why that mattered. Being a subcontractor meant he had more control over his own hours than a traditional job would allow. That control was something he needed, because he was already working on a parallel plan that required time he could not beg from a 9-to-5. His wife Gina brought a different kind of foundation to the partnership. She holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree in education, and was working as a tutor while Al laid the early groundwork on the property. That is a detail worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how the early years of Lumna Acres actually worked. For a significant portion of the channel's early life, Gina's income was what kept the household running, while Al poured labor into land that was not yet producing anything close to a return. The homestead was being built on a tutor's salary and a subcontractor's part-time schedule. The reason Al has given for starting down this path is straightforward, and it has stayed consistent across years of interviews and videos. Health. He and Gina wanted to grow the most nutritionally dense food they could for their family. Not as a lifestyle choice made from a place of comfort, but as a considered decision that they believed they had to build from the ground up if they wanted to control what went into it. The only way to fully control what goes into food, in Al's view, is to control the land where it grows. That conviction was the foundation of everything that came after. It was also the thing that, years later, would push him further than most homesteaders ever go. The Lumna Acres YouTube channel registered in 2012, but the content that defined the channel's identity was coming consistently by 2014 and 2015. What those early years documented was straightforward in concept and relentless in practice. A family buying raw land in Littleton, New Hampshire, more than 500 acres of it, and beginning the process of turning it into a working homestead from the ground up. No existing structures, no cleared fields, no systems in place, just land, a plan, and a camera. What made Lumna Acres different from the many homesteading channels that existed in that space was not polish or production quality. It was the combination of Al's approach on camera and the genuine difficulty of what they were doing. Al talked to the camera the way someone talks to a friend standing next to them while they work. He was not performing, he was explaining. Viewers got the impression they were actually there on the property, watching him figure things out, which, in the early years, he often was. The family raised chickens, pigs, and Highland cattle. They built a greenhouse in partnership with Rimmel Greenhouse Systems, documenting the multi-day installation in detail. They brought in a TYM T5074 tractor for heavy work, septic installation, material handling, barn construction, snow management across 500 acres, and eventually became a featured partner for TYM in their promotional materials. Al's chicken coop famously got named New York City after viewers submitted suggestions in the comments of an early video. A significant external moment came in May 2017 when Justin Rhodes, a homesteading filmmaker who was traveling the country with his family on what he called the Great American Farm Tour, stopped at Lumna Acres. Rhodes documented his visit to the property on the Lumna Acres channel, and the exposure introduced Al and Gina to a wider audience within the homesteading community. Al's method of using chickens to help restore a section of orchard on the property was highlighted during the visit, and the response from Rhodes' audience was strong. But the moment that genuinely broke through to a much larger audience was a single video. The video's title was Time-Lapse Post and Beam Barn Kit Build that we bought off the internet. The concept was simple, a time-lapse of Al assembling a timber frame barn kit purchased from a company called Jamaica Cottage Shop. What he built himself, on his own property, and condensed into a few minutes of compressed footage. That video crossed 13 million views. For perspective, Lumna Acres' total subscriber count at the time was in the tens of thousands. A single video pulling 13 million views is not a homesteading milestone, it is a mainstream internet milestone. It put Lumna Acres in front of people who had never thought about off-grid living, who were not searching for homesteading content, but who watched a man build a barn in a time-lapse and decided they wanted to know what else he was doing. The channel grew. By late 2024, the subscriber count had crossed 350,000. The channel had accumulated over 184 million total views across close to 2,000 videos. The Lumna Acres website was operating a merchandise store. Lumna Acres LLC was formally registered in New Hampshire in March 2018, now in good standing. The channel had brand relationships, audience loyalty, and a decade of documented work behind it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Al started thinking about something different. The early promise of Lumna Acres was specific. Build an off-grid homestead, document the journey, live self-sufficiently. That promise had been kept. The homestead existed. The systems worked. The house, built using the same post and beam construction method that became the viral barn, was standing. The land was producing food. The family was doing what they had said they would do. So when Al began to talk about regenerative farming as the next direction, it was not a departure from the original mission. It was what happened when the original mission reached its logical conclusion, and the question became, what is the next version of this? Homesteading and regenerative farming are related, but not interchangeable. Homesteading is primarily about self-sufficiency, growing your own food, reducing dependence on outside systems, building a life that operates on its own terms. Regenerative farming is about something bigger. It is about the land itself, about managing soil biology, rotating livestock in patterns that restore rather than deplete, building systems where different species interact in ways that mimic natural ecosystems, and producing food at a scale that extends beyond one family. The philosophy is similar, the ambition is different. Al had said years earlier in an interview that he and Gina tried to keep their why in front of them on the hard days. The why was health. It was sustainable food. It was control over what goes into the land and what comes out of it. That why had not changed. What had changed was how far he thought it could reasonably go. The transition did not happen overnight, and it was not announced all at once. The channel description shifted. The language Al used in videos shifted. The word homesteading began to share space with regenerative. And then, at some point, came the announcement that explained everything. Al and Gina had purchased a 150-year-old vacant farm, not the same property, a different one entirely. The Lumna Acres YouTube channel description, which Al controls and which reflects his current intent for the channel, reads as follows. They are a husband and wife team who, after years of living off-grid and building their homestead from scratch, have taken on a whole new adventure. They bought a 150-year-old vacant farm, a place they describe as having dreamed about for years, and are now working to restore its old buildings and transform it into a thriving regenerative farm. That is a meaningful statement from someone who spent a decade building something from raw ground. A 150-year-old vacant farm means something specific. It means structures that exist but have not been actively maintained. It means land that was once worked but has sat dormant. It means the bones of something that operated in a completely different era of farming, built to different specifications with different methods, now waiting to be either restored or allowed to continue deteriorating. It also means there is a history built into the place that a raw parcel of land does not have. Soil that was once farmed has memory in it. Old buildings, even in poor condition, carry information about how the land was organized and how work was done on it. For someone transitioning into regenerative farming, which is fundamentally about working with natural systems rather than against them, an old farm is not a liability, it is a starting point. To help them map out how to approach the property, Al brought in one of the most significant figures in American regenerative agriculture. In 2025, Joel Salatin visited the Lumna Acres farm. Salatin is the founder of Polyface Farm, in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, a 700-acre operation that has become one of the most well-known examples of multi-species rotational farming in the United States. He has written more than a dozen books on regenerative agriculture, consults with farms internationally, and has been described as one of the most influential voices in the modern sustainable food movement. In 2025, Angel Studios released a documentary about him titled The Lunatic Farmer. Al described the visit on the channel as bringing Salatin in to walk the 150-year-old property and help them map out a regenerative future. He noted they got more from the consultation than they had expected. That is not a casual statement. Salatin does not make farm visits as a courtesy call. His presence at the Lumna Acres property in 2025 was a signal that what Al and Gina were planning was being taken seriously at a level beyond YouTube content. Here is the part of the story that takes a moment to sit with. Al Lumna spent the better part of 10 years building a homestead from raw ground. He documented every stage of it on camera, building an audience of 350,000 people along the way. The channel that had a single video hit 13 million views was not a struggling channel, it was a successful one. The Lumna Acres LLC was in good standing, the audience was loyal, the brand relationships were real. And then he bought an old farm and started a new chapter. Most people, when they reach the destination they spent years working toward, stay there. They enjoy what they built. They document the operation of the thing rather than the construction of the next thing. The audience had watched Al build a homestead. They had expected to keep watching him run it. The decision to introduce a 150-year-old farm and pivot the channel's entire mission into regenerative agriculture was not what that audience anticipated. And the question it raises is the one that sits at the center of this story. Why does a person walk away from what works? Al has given partial answers to this over the years, in comments and interviews and videos, never as a single clean statement, but as a consistent through line. The original reason for everything, health, food quality, control over what the land produces, never became less important. It became more important. As the original homestead matured, and as Al spent more time in the homesteading space, the question of what a sustainable food system could look like at scale became more pressing, not less. There is also something Al said in an early interview, back when he was still a subcontractor and the channel was just beginning, that has stayed accurate across everything that came after. He said homesteading is harder than a 9-to-5. He said people assume it must be simpler to live off the land, but it is actually more demanding in almost every measurable way. He said on the hard days, they came back to the why, the reason they started. The fact that he chose, after a decade of doing one genuinely hard thing, to take on something harder, and to do so at a larger scale, in an older building with a more complex land management system, says something specific about how seriously he means that. A detail worth noting, because it says something about what the channel's trajectory looked like during this transition period. Between March 2024 and July 2025, roughly the same window during which the new farm was being announced, and the channel's direction was shifting, the Lumna Acres subscriber count grew by approximately 14,000 subscribers. That number is from channel analytics tracking for that period. It is not explosive growth, but it is steady, forward movement during a period of significant change. The channel did not lose its audience when the mission changed. By mid-2025, the channel was sitting at 369,000 subscribers, with over 184 million total views across the lifetime of the channel. Nearly 967 videos had been uploaded. The posting schedule, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, was being maintained. What those numbers reflect is a channel that pivoted its entire identity and retained its audience while doing so. That is not a given. Homesteading channels and regenerative farming channels are related niches, but they are not the same niche. The viewer who subscribed to watch a family build a homestead from raw ground is not automatically the viewer who wants to watch the restoration of a 150-year-old farm's soil biology. The fact that those audiences overlap significantly enough to sustain the channel through the transition suggests that what people were actually watching was not just the homesteading, it was Al. The business infrastructure that had been built around the channel also remained active. The Lumna Acres website continued operating its merchandise store. The brand partnerships that had been established, with TYM Tractors, with Rimmel Greenhouses, and others, represented relationships built on Al's credibility in the space, not on a specific content format. A man who consulted with Joel Salatin about regenerative farming in 2025 has, if anything, more credibility in the agricultural space than a man who built a barn time-lapse a decade earlier. The 13 million view video still sits on the channel. The early homesteading content still sits on the channel, Nothing was removed. The record of what was built at the first property remains visible. What changed was what the channel started building next. As of mid-2025, Lumna Acres was 3 videos per week, consistent, on schedule. The content was centered on the 150-year-old farm, the restoration work, the building of new systems, the process of understanding what the land had been and what it could become. Joel Salutin had walked the property and provided guidance on the regenerative plan. The audience was watching, the numbers were growing, and the work was underway. What Al and Gina are attempting with this property is, by any honest measure, harder than what they did with the original homestead. Building from raw ground is a known challenge. Restoring an old farm is a different kind of challenge. You are working with the decisions of people who farmed that land 150 years ago, with soil that carries the history of those decisions, with buildings that may have structural issues that only reveal themselves once you start working, and then layering a regenerative farming system on top of that restoration, one that Salutin himself came to help plan, adds another level of complexity that most homesteaders never attempt. The family is doing it anyway. The story of Lumna Acres is not a story about someone who fell off the map, burned out, or walked away from what they built. It is a story about what happens when the original dream is fully realized, and the question becomes, what is bigger than this? Al Lumna came from Massachusetts, with no farming background, worked as a subcontractor while Gina tutored, and they both poured time and money into raw New Hampshire land, built a homestead from the ground up over nearly a decade, hit 13 million views with a barn time-lapse, and then, at the point where most people would have settled into what they had made, bought a 150-year-old vacant farm and started rebuilding at a larger scale. There is a kind of person who, when they reach the top of one hill, looks for the next one. The channel description says it clearly. After years of living off-grid and building a homestead from scratch, they've taken on a whole new adventure. That is not a retreat. That is the same conviction that started all of this, applied to a bigger piece of land. What happens next at Lumna Acres will unfold on camera, 3 times a week, on a farm that is over 150 years old and just getting started with its next chapter. The question for people who have been watching this family for years is whether Al made the right call. Whether starting over at the scale of a historic farm, with all the uncertainty that involves, is the right move for someone who had already built something that worked. Would you have stayed with the homestead? Or would you have bought the old farm and tried to build something larger?